welcome. If you're listening to this, you're probably looking for something slow, something soothing, perhaps something that will gently hold your attention as you drift towards sleep. You've come to the right place. Tonight, we're going to journey far back through time and across many lands. We're not going to focus on kings or conquerors, or on battles or revolutions. Instead, we'll settle into something much quieter, more ordinary, and, in many ways, more enduring. We'll explore one of the oldest human problems. How do you keep food from going bad? Before the hum of refrigerators, before the frost of freezers, long before expiry dates and vacuum sealing, human beings still had to eat, and food has never waited patiently. So together we'll wander through ancient kitchens and storage pits, past buried jars and smoke-filled huts, from the sands of Egypt to the ice houses of Persia. We'll see what people dried, buried, salted, sealed, froze, or fermented to carry themselves through seasons, droughts, and uncertain times. It wasn't always pleasant, it wasn't always successful, but it was always necessary. So if you're ready, settle in. Let the past roll gently over you. And imagine, if you like, the quiet, flickering hearths of forgotten kitchens, and the slow, careful hands that once kept hunger at bay. Let's begin. Imagine yourself as an ordinary person. Not now, but centuries ago. Before electricity, before plastic, before even the idea of cold storage. Your home is made of wood, or mud brick, or stone. The seasons pass outside your walls just as they always have. Hot, wet, cold, dry. And your food, well, it spoils. It spoils fast. Without cold air or sealed packaging, food begins to decay the moment it's harvested, caught, or cooked. Meat sours, grain molds, fruit bruises, browns, collapses. And yet you need to eat tomorrow, and the day after, and the week after that. So your days are filled with rituals of prevention. You wrap things in leaves. You hang them from the rafters. You bury them in pits lined with straw. You salt and smoke and dry and hope. In many parts of the world, that meant working with what you had. And what you had was often the earth itself. Root cellars, simple, dark holes in the ground, were some of the earliest tools in the human preservation toolkit. Dug below the frost line in colder regions, or in shaded courtyards where the sun rarely reached, these spaces harnessed the stable coolness of soil. Here, vegetables could survive for weeks. A clay pot filled with grain might last a season, if the mice didn't get to it. But even then, every meal was a small gamble. Bread might be safe today, and sour tomorrow. A pot of milk might seem fine in the morning, and curdle by sunset. There were no expiration labels, no color-coded fridges, no buzzing alarms. You learned to trust your nose, your tongue, and the wisdom passed down from your mother's mother. In warm, humid climates, food decayed especially quickly, so people in these regions relied on the power of the sun. They dried fruits, dates, figs, apricots, on flat stones or woven mats. They dried fish in the salty air beside the sea. They dried strips of meat until they were hard and leathery, and then they stored them in bags, or pots, or wrapped in cloth. But drying was only possible when the weather allowed. Rain could ruin everything. A single damp night could bring mildew and ruin to an entire season's harvest. So there was always a quiet urgency. Even in the earliest villages, you'd find storerooms with shelves made of stone or wood, designed to keep things off the damp floor. You might see clay jars sealed with wax or animal fat to keep out insects. And always, there were rodents, rats, mice, weevils, unseen guests in your pantry, nibbling away at your precious stores. Keeping food wasn't just about slowing nature, it was about keeping it out. Even as people began to settle and grow crops, food remained a fleeting thing. A fresh fish was a race against the clock. A hunted rabbit had only hours before it turned. And so, preservation became a rhythm. Every morning a task, every evening a ritual, a constant struggle to push against time. But amidst this struggle, there was also quiet wisdom. the knowledge that came from centuries of observation, from tasting, watching, and adapting. People learned that clay kept things cooler than wood, that lining a basket with ash could ward off rot, that certain herbs, tucked between layers, might keep bugs away. Even the act of fermentation, so central to preserving vegetables and dairy, was likely discovered by accident. A forgotten pot, a strange smell, a sour taste, that didn't kill anyone. And from that, a method was born. In this way, ancient people were scientists, testing, refining, preserving their survival one meal at a time, and though they never used the word, preservation was life. Imagine the coastline of ancient Greece. Jagged rocks plunge into the Aegean Sea, whitewashed homes cling to the hillsides, and down in the coves and small wooden boats and open-air markets, fish are everywhere, fresh, shimmering, and fleeting. The sea offers its bounty, but only briefly. And for the Greeks, preservation became a daily art form, especially with something so slippery, so perishable as fish. You wake before dawn. The fishermen have just come in, hauling baskets heavy with sardines, anchovies, and small mackerel. They glisten in the morning light, but already the sun is rising, and the clock is ticking, so the preserving begins. Salt, the simplest, oldest, and most powerful ally in the fight against rot. In coastal towns across the ancient Greek world, women and men rubbed salt into fresh fish within moments of the catch. They layered them, fish, salt, inside wide clay vats or stone basins, sometimes pressing them down with rocks to keep them submerged in their own juices. This method created a kind of pickled fish paste, pungent, oily, long-lasting. Some called it gyros, the early version of Roman garum, a fermented fish sauce used across the Mediterranean. It was strong, it was strange, and it lasted. These fish sauces weren't just condiments, they were storage solutions, a way to make the sea's bounty stretch far inland, even months after the boats had returned. But salt wasn't just for fish. Preserving olives, another staple of the Greek diet, also relied on the sea's mineral gift. Green olives were soaked in brine for days, sometimes weeks, before being pressed for oil or eaten whole. This process didn't just preserve them, it transformed them. Preservation wasn't only about staving off decay. Sometimes it created new flavors, new textures, even new customs. In the hills away from the coast, grain was another challenge. Wheat and barley had to be kept dry, always dry, so families stored it in tall clay pithoi, giant jars sometimes as tall as a person, buried partly in the ground for coolness and stability. Imagine walking into a rural Greek storeroom. The air is dry, filled with the scent of dust and old grain. The floor is packed earth, and around you rise the rounded shoulders of pithoi, sealed with mud or wax, sometimes covered with a flat stone. Inside each one, months of careful effort, a hedge against the hunger of winter, a promise that, for a while longer, the stomach would stay full. But even these methods had their risks. Moldavian moisture, insects, one bad harvest, one spoiled jar, and the consequences could ripple through a household for months. Preservation for the Greeks was not glamorous. It was not poetic. It was necessary, ordinary, repetitive. But from that necessity came tradition, the drying of herbs on strings beside the hearth, the rolling of cheese in ashes or olive oil to keep it safe, the careful layering of dried figs and nuts in woven baskets lined with leaves. Each home was its own tiny battleground against rot, each family its own quiet laboratory of survival, and all across the sunlit shores and stony highlands, the Greeks learned to wait, to store, to salt, to endure, because no matter how abundant the sea, it always disappeared by sundown. Now, let us leave behind the blue Aegean and travel southward, past the eastern Mediterranean, past the sands of Sinai, to the long, winding river that gave rise to one of history's earliest and most enduring civilizations, ancient Egypt. Here, the Nile flows like a ribbon of life through the desert, and on either side, the land bakes under a relentless sun. The climate in ancient Egypt was unforgiving, hot, dry, and rarely kind to anything perishable. And yet, the Nile provided. Each year it flooded, and each year it receded, leaving behind rich, dark soil. Crops thrived. Wheat, barley, onions, garlic, leeks, lentils, and dates. But once harvested, the question remained, how do you keep it all from spoiling? Imagine yourself in a modest Egyptian household, perhaps 3,000 years ago. Your home is made of sun-dried mud bricks. Your food is your lifeline, and your storage methods have been passed down for generations. Grain, the cornerstone of your diet, is precious. It's ground into flour for bread. It's boiled for porridge. It's even used in brewing beer. So it must be protected. Large ceramic storage jars, wide at the middle and narrow at the top, are used to keep grain safe from pests and humidity. These jars are sometimes stored in cool, shaded areas of the home, tucked beneath platforms or half buried in the ground, sealed with clay or mud, sometimes smeared with animal fat to ward off insects. The air inside is still, dark, dry, a stable world inside a fragile shell. The walls of wealthier homes might even contain small food niches built directly into the stone, carved cubbies where jars of dried dates or onions could sit, undisturbed for weeks. Further upriver, in larger towns and estates, specialized granaries rose beside temples and royal compounds. These were often round or rectangular, elevated above the ground to prevent flooding, and guarded against theft and infestation. They were not merely buildings. They were vaults of survival, and their operation was a matter of ritual, record, and reverence. Even in death, Egyptians believed food must be preserved. Tombs were stocked with carefully sealed jars of honey, dried meats, beer, and bread for the afterlife. Some of these provisions, astonishingly, still survive, still sealed, still intact, after thousands of years in the dry desert air. Imagine that, a loaf of bread baked 40 centuries ago. Still recognizable, still waiting. In this arid climate, drying was a key technique. Fish from the Nile were gutted, salted, and laid out to dry under nets. Fruits, especially dates and figs, were split open and left to wrinkle beneath the sun. The process was simple, silent, slow, and it transformed food into something more than sustenance. It became a record of time, a memory, pressed into texture and taste. The wealthier classes, of course, had more resources, servants, cool storage rooms, access to imported goods like spices or resins that could aid in preservation. But even for the humbler families, the desert was both challenge and blessing. It dried what it didn't destroy. And the Nile brought bounty to be guarded, against heat, against time, against forgetting. So day after day, food was gathered, stored, protected, and night after night, you slept, knowing that the next meal depended on choices made many days ago. In this way, the ancient Egyptians built not just monuments and tombs, but systems, quiet, careful systems for keeping hunger at bay. And when the desert wind rustled through the date palms, it carried with it the scent of old grain and survival. Now, let the desert fall behind. Let the sun fade into a cold, high sky, and imagine yourself stepping out onto the wide, endless plains of Central Asia. This is the steppe, wind-swept, treeless, open in all directions. Here, in what is now Mongolia and parts of Siberia, life has always been shaped by the seasons, particularly the cold. In summer, the grass grows thick, the animals graze, but in winter, the land turns harsh. Temperatures fall below freezing for weeks, even months at a time. Snow carpets the ground, and the wind never seems to rest. The people who live here, nomads, do not have granaries or storehouses. Their homes, called gurs or yurts, are round, movable tents made of felt and wood. They follow their herds, sheep, goats, yaks, and horses, from pasture to pasture, and they carry their food with them. So how do they preserve what they need? You wake in a yurt on a crisp morning. A cooking fire smolders near the center. The air smells of wool, smoke, and milk, and in the rafters above, hanging from wooden poles, are strips of meat, drying, curing, waiting. Drying, meat on the steppe is both practical and cultural. It's called borts, thin strips of beef or yak, cut carefully and air-dried in the open air. The cold, dry climate helps preserve it naturally. The wind keeps insects away, and the meat hardens into long-lasting protein. It may not be tender, it may not be flavorful, but it will feed a family deep into winter. Milk, too, is preserved, not by cold, but by transformation. Yaks and goats are milked daily during the warm season. The milk is then churned, boiled, dried, or fermented into a host of practical products. Arul, hard dried curds that resemble chalky candies. Arag, fermented mare's milk, tangy and gently alcoholic. And thickened yogurts that can be stored for days in cool weather. There are no refrigerators here, but the land itself becomes one. In winter, frozen meat is simply stored outdoors, hung from trees or tucked beneath heavy snow. Nature does the work. The cold air keeps meat firm, unspoiled. Even milk can be left outside in sealed containers, where it freezes solid until needed. But preservation isn't always about freezing or drying. Sometimes it's about fat. Fat is rendered from meat and poured over cooked or boiled food in jars, sealing it in. A layer of solid fat keeps air, insects, and bacteria out. The result? Food that lasts weeks without spoiling, even during migrations. Still, life on the steppe is uncertain. Preservation is a hedge against the unpredictable. A bad season, a lost animal, a sudden storm, and food becomes dangerously scarce. So every scrap is used. Bones become broth, milk becomes cheese, meat becomes borts. Nothing is wasted, because nothing is guaranteed. Even the act of preparing food for preservation becomes a form of storytelling. Grandparents showing children how to string meat, how to test dried curds, how to recognize spoiled milk by smell or touch. And in the long cold nights, around a dim fire, these quiet acts of sustenance become the rhythm of survival. Here, there are no shelves, no pantries, no stone-walled kitchens, only what the land provides, only what the family carries, only what can be dried, smoked, or frozen by the sky. On the steppe, preservation is not a choice. It is tradition. It is memory. And it is life lived in motion. Now, let us follow the ancient trade routes westward and southward, past the Caspian, past the mountain passes, to a land where the summers were scorching, and ingenuity was born from necessity. Welcome to the heartlands of ancient Persia and to the high plains of what is now Afghanistan. Here, in a climate of punishing heat and dry winds, early engineers devised some of the most elegant and forgotten methods of food preservation the world has ever seen. They used earth, they used geometry, they used silence, and they built ice. Imagine standing outside a domed structure rising from the desert floor, broad at the base, tapering toward the top like a giant cone. Its walls are thick, built of sun-dried clay mixed with straw and ash. You approach slowly. The air is still. And within this ancient marvel lies winter. This is a yakchal, literally an ice pit. A building designed to make and store ice in the middle of the desert. How? In winter, water would be directed into shallow pools near the base of the structure. At night, temperatures drop just enough to freeze a thin layer. Night after night, more layers formed. The ice was then broken, gathered, and lowered into the deep subterranean chamber beneath the dome. There, insulated by walls nearly 2 meters thick, it could last well into the summer months. But the yakchal didn't store just ice. It stored food, jars of rose water, sherbets, fruits, dairy, even meat. Anything perishable could be cooled in its shadow. The cool, dry interior was a haven against the brutal heat outside, and for the wealthy, it meant refreshment, cold drinks, cool meals, a luxury few could imagine in a sun-scorched land. Elsewhere in the region, preservation took simpler forms. Earth cellars dug into shaded hillsides, sealed clay pots buried in dry soil, dates stored in woven baskets hung from rafters to avoid ants and rodents. In villages across ancient Afghanistan, high-altitude settlements used cold mountain air to preserve root vegetables, potatoes, onions, and turnips left in open-air sheds, where freezing nights did the work of modern refrigeration. Food wasn't just stored in structures, it was shaped by the land itself. The Persians developed early wind towers called badgirs to draw cool air into buildings. These passive cooling systems often kept pantries and storage rooms bearably cold. The breeze did the work. No machines, no wires, just air and time. Even preservation of milk and dairy followed this pattern of quiet ingenuity. Yogurt, known as mast, was common. It could be strained into kashk, a dried dairy product that resembled small white balls. Kashk could last for months, even years, in a dry climate. A handful rehydrated in boiling water could turn into a warm, nourishing soup. In every home, these practices were humble, but together they formed a system of resilience. Because in these lands, food was not a constant. It was earned, gathered, protected. It was watched, carefully. A jar sealed too loosely, a shadow too short, a pot left just a bit too close to the sun, and it would all be lost. So, you imagine yourself walking barefoot across a clay courtyard. Your arms carry a jar of fresh yogurt, and you lower it gently into a shaded pit beside your home. You cover it with cloth and stone, and you walk away, trusting that the silence of the earth will keep it cool. Because here, the earth was your refrigerator, the wind was your fan, and geometry was your ally. Now, we drift eastward, beyond the mountains of China, past river valleys and rice terraces, to the windswept shores of ancient Korea and the wooded hills of early Japan. Here the challenge was different. The climate was not always scorching, but it was fickle. Cold winters, humid summers, short harvest windows, and long, hungry months between them. So the people of these lands turned to one of humanity's oldest, most mysterious allies: fermentation. It wasn't always intentional. At first, it was likely an accident. A forgotten pot, a strange smell, a sour taste. That didn't kill. But over time, it became a craft, a ritual, and in many ways, a way of life. Imagine yourself in a Korean village long ago. The leaves have turned, the harvest is in, and families begin the preparation for winter. Large clay jars, ongi, are lined up in neat rows outside homes. Some are sunk into the ground, others sit in clusters, shaded from the sun. Inside them, layers of cabbage, radish, garlic, salt, and chili, pressed down, packed tight, left to rest, and to change. This is kimchi, though it wasn't always spicy. Before the arrival of chili peppers, it was simpler, cooler, sour and salty, often with notes of fermented fish. Fermenting vegetables wasn't just a preservation technique. It was nutrition, flavor, memory. Each family had its own recipe, each village its own rhythm. And over time, kimchi became more than food. It became tradition. And the Japanese Waseras had their own fermentation rituals. In the early periods, long before modern refrigeration, rural families relied on miso and soy sauce, both created through the slow, careful process of allowing beans, salt, and mold to work their quiet magic. Soybeans were cooked, mixed with grain, inoculated with koji mold, and left to age. The result: rich pastes and dark liquids that could flavor soups, preserve vegetables, and store protein for months at a time. Now, rice, too, was preserved through fermentation. Narazushi, the ancestor of modern sushi, was a striking method. Fish was salted heavily, packed between layers of fermented rice, and left to cure for weeks, sometimes even months. The rice was often discarded. Only the aged fish was eaten. It may sound unusual, even unappetizing, but for centuries, it was one of the few ways to safely store fresh protein through the changing seasons. In the mountain villages of both Korea and Japan, dairy was rare, but grains, vegetables, and fish formed the staples of survival, and fermentation turned the perishable into the durable. Even fruit could be preserved in this way. In Korea, plums were salted and turned into thick syrups. In Japan, sour umeboshi plums were dried and pickled, stored in wooden tubs and ceramic jars, their tartness a lasting memory of summer's end. These foods were stored with care, dark corners of the kitchen, underground cool rooms, lattice shelves in airy spaces, where mold and salt could work together, quietly. No buzzing, no lights, no machines, just the slow, patient passing of time. Fermentation wasn't always predictable. Some jars failed, some spoiled, but those that succeeded could feed a family through the deep snows of winter, the long rains of spring. And beyond the taste, beyond the science, there was always something a little mystical about it. How food could change and last, how rot could become nourishment, how silence could become flavor. So you imagine yourself crouched beside a clay jar, lifting the lid slowly. The scent is strong, sharp, alive. It's not the food you put in, but it is food still. And that, in these distant kitchens, was enough. Now, we cross the Pacific to the towering heights of South America's Andes Mountains, a place where the air is thin, the nights are cold, and the people strong, practical, and deeply connected to the rhythm of the land. Here, among stone terraces and winding trails, the Inca Empire thrived. And with it came one of the most remarkable methods of food preservation ever devised, a method that relied not on tools or jars or flame, but on the mountain itself. Imagine yourself waking before dawn in an Inca village, perched high in the hills. Stone walls curve along the slope. The sky is still dark, and scattered across the ground are small piles of potatoes. But not just any potatoes. These are chuño, freeze-dried by the mountain air. Chuño begins with a simple principle. Expose the potatoes to the freezing night, then let the warmth of the day draw the moisture out. Night after night, the cycle continues, freezing, thawing, drying. Then, the villagers return. They trample the softened potatoes underfoot, barefoot, squeezing out the last bits of moisture. The skins break, the flesh hardens, and soon, the humble potato becomes something else entirely. A dried, shelf-stable food, light enough to carry for miles, durable enough to last for years, nourishing when little else remains. Chuño became a cornerstone of Inca survival, stored in woven bags, stacked in mountain granaries, or tucked into stone niches in family homes. It provided a buffer against famine, drought, and war. It could be boiled into stews, rehydrated in soups, or eaten plain if needed. But potatoes weren't the only food to undergo this alpine transformation. Llama and alpaca meat, cut into strips, dried in the high-altitude air, became charqui, the ancestor of modern jerky. It was tough, chewy, but rich in protein, ideal for long journeys across the vast Inca road network. These foods were more than survival rations. They were a system, a method of decentralizing risk, of sharing storage across the empire. The Inca built enormous communal granaries, called kulkas, situated along trade routes and mountain passes. Carefully designed with stone walls and slanted floors, they captured the cold, dry winds and preserved food without rot, not for one family, but for many. And so, a traveler could stop along the road and find food. A soldier could be fed on campaign. A community could endure a failed harvest, with reserves tucked safely in the rocks above. Even grain, quinoa and maize, was stored in this way, dried completely, protected from moisture by layers of thatch, stone, and airflow. There were no locks, no thermometers, no calculations, only trust in stone, and cold, and time. And all around these mountain villages, a culture grew that understood the value of preservation, not as luxury, but as duty. Because here, life was never easy. The weather could change without warning. The earth could shake. The frost could come too early. So food was always more than food. It was safety. It was foresight. It was love handed down. In bags of chuño and slabs of charqui, and when the night fell across the Andes and the stars gathered above the silent terraces, the people slept, knowing that deep in their stone storerooms, they had prepared. Now we journey north, across the equator, beyond the rainforests and deserts, to the woodlands, plains, and deserts of ancient North America. Here, long before refrigeration, before written records, and before colonial disruption, the indigenous peoples of this vast land developed deeply local and remarkably adaptive ways to store their food. Their preservation methods were quiet, simple, earthbound, but they were ingenious, as in shaped by the rhythm of the land. Imagine yourself in the autumn forests of the Great Lakes region. The air is crisp, the trees are golden, and a family is preparing for winter. They've gathered maize, corn, dried beans, squash sliced into thin pieces. This trio, corn, beans, and squash, is often called the Three Sisters, and to the people who grew them, they were more than crops. They were companions, sustenance, a sacred unity. The corn is dried on racks in the sun, its kernels hardening into small golden gems. The beans are strung in bunches and hung from wooden beams, and the squash is laid out carefully, turned each day to dry evenly. Once dry, all of it is stored underground, in pits. Lined with bark, grass, or woven mats, these storage pits are dug below the frost line, then covered with earth and stones. Cool, dark, inhospitable to pests. They serve as natural refrigerators. Sometimes, foods are double protected, first wrapped in animal hide or bark, then placed in the pit. This keeps moisture out, and the rodents away. In the dry southwest, preservation took a different shape. There, the sun was not the enemy, but the ally. In Pueblo communities, corn and peppers were laid out on flat roofs to dry in the sun. Red chili ristras, long braided strands of drying peppers, swayed gently in the desert breeze, a kind of decoration, but also a pantry in the open air. In the northern forests and plains, meat preservation was critical. Buffalo, deer, and elk were hunted in large numbers, and to preserve them, people created something remarkable: pemmican. Pemmican is a dense, high-calorie food made from dried, powdered meat, usually buffalo, mixed with rendered fat and sometimes dried berries. It's compact. It's durable. It can last for years. To make it, meat is sliced thin, dried in the sun or over low fires, then pounded into a coarse powder. Fat is melted and poured over it. The mixture is pressed into containers, rawhide bags, clay vessels, even hollowed bones, and sealed. A few bites of pemmican could keep a traveler going for hours. And for some communities, it was more than a food. It was trade. It was survival. It was winter's lifeline. Along the coasts, fish was dried and smoked. Salmon, especially, in the Pacific Northwest, where families built long racks near the water and hung fish in strips to dry slowly over smoldering fires. The smoke infused the fish with preservation, flavor, and memory. Sometimes berries were mashed and dried into leathery sheets, tart and chewy, lasting long after the bushes had gone bare. In every region, preservation techniques matched the land, not imposed from outside, but grown from place, from experience, from listening. Food was never wasted, never taken for granted. Every part of the animal, the plant, the harvest, was used, transformed, stored. So you imagine yourself in a quiet clearing, beside a low fire, turning slices of meat on a rack. You check the pits, you listen to the wind, and you know that your work today means warmth tomorrow. Because to preserve food was to preserve the people, to preserve memory, and to show respect for the land that gave it. Now we shift our gaze to the eastern shores of the Mediterranean, to a landscape shaped by olive trees and limestone hills, by sun-baked plateaus and silent craggy valleys. This is the Levant, ancient Canaan, Judea, and Israel, a land steeped in layers of human presence, and where the struggle to keep food safe from heat, rot, and insects was as old as the cities themselves. Here, the sun was both a giver and a threat. It ripened the fig, but it spoiled the fish. It dried the grape, but it also awakened the fly. So people turned inward, into the stone. Imagine yourself living in one of the hillside villages of the Judean highlands. Your home is built from the very earth, blocks of limestone fitted by hand. Just beneath your dwelling lies a cool, dark chamber, a cave. These natural caves, often expanded or smoothed by human hands, became the pantries of the ancient world. Step inside. It's quiet. The air is noticeably cooler. On shelves carved into the stone, there are clay vessels, tied closed with leather or woven lids. Some hold grain, barley, wheat. Others hold dried fruits, figs, raisins, dates. Further back, in the darkest corner sit heavy jars sealed with wax or olive oil. These hold the real treasures: olive oil, honey, even fermented fish sauce. Outside, the heat is rising, but here, within the slow-breathing rock, food waits. Protected. Preservation was never a single method in this region. It was a constellation of habits, small, thoughtful acts. In the Jordan Valley, fish from the Dead Sea and Sea of Galilee were often salted and sun-dried, a quick process, done just hours after the catch, before the desert air could turn the meat foul. Olive oil was stored in tall, narrow amphorae, kept in shaded storerooms, or buried partway in the ground to maintain a constant temperature. The oil itself, dense and golden, helped preserve herbs, cheese, and dried tomatoes, acting as a barrier against air and moisture. Cheese was pressed and salted, sometimes wrapped in herbs or dipped in brine, then tucked into baskets lined with leaves. Fruit, once dried, was layered between sheets of pressed grape must, a kind of early fruit leather, and tied with twine, portable, durable, sweet. And in the highland towns, wine was not just for drinking, it was also for keeping. Grapes were crushed, fermented in stone basins, then stored in large clay jars. Wine kept better than water, and it could be traded or saved. Archaeologists have discovered these storage methods not just from texts, but from evidence. Cellars cut into bedrock, jars still sealed, pits of charred grain, left behind by fire, yet telling their own story. Some of these spaces remained untouched for centuries. A pantry, fossilized. And in the caves of Qumran and the cliffs near Ein Gedi, food storage met religion. Communities like the Essenes, those who wrote the Dead Sea Scrolls, preserved not just knowledge, but also food, tucked into jars and buried away. For the common household, preservation was constant vigilance. Lids tied tight, pots moved out of the sun, markets visited early, before the heat could spoil the morning's catch. So you imagine yourself walking back from the market, a basket on your hip. Inside, some dried figs, a wheel of salty cheese, a loaf of sour barley bread. And as you pass into the cool of your cave kitchen, you feel the shift in air, relief, and safety. Because in this land of brightness and heat, shade was survival. Now let the warmth of the Levant fade. Let the olive groves dissolve into mist. Let the quiet wind carry us north, to the rugged coastlines and dense forests of ancient Scandinavia. This is the land of the Vikings. Long winters, short growing seasons, cold seas, and a life lived always within arm's reach of hunger. The people here had little choice but to learn the craft of preservation early, or starve. Imagine yourself in a small wooden longhouse. The walls are thick with the scent of smoke. The rafters are blackened from years of indoor fires. And above your head, near the central beam, hang dozens of objects. Not decorations, but dinner. Fish, strung up and drying, slabs of meat, cured with salt, bundles of herbs, slowly crisping in the warm air. Outside, the fog drifts through the trees, and inside, the work of survival continues. The Vikings, for all their reputation as raiders, were deeply connected to the rhythms of land and sea, and preserving food was a matter of ingenuity and patience. Fishing was central. Herring, cod, and salmon were caught in huge quantities, when the seas were kind, and brought home to be preserved. One method was drying. Fish were split open, gutted, and hung on large wooden racks called yell. high above the ground to keep dogs and vermin away. The wind did most of the work. Over weeks, the fish hardened into stockfish, a brittle, light food that could be stored for months and rehydrated when needed. Another method was fermentation. Gravlax, now a delicacy, began as a practical preservation technique. Salmon was packed in salt and buried in the cool earth near the shoreline. There, it would ferment slightly, softening in texture, deepening in flavor, and lasting well beyond the season. But it wasn't only fish. Meat was treated similarly. Boar, reindeer, and beef were salted, smoked, or both. Smokehouses, small dark sheds filled with smoldering wood, were used to slowly dry meat, driving away bacteria and pests. This method also flavored the food, a hint of birch or alder in every bite, a taste of home, of hearth, of effort. In the forests, wild berries were gathered and dried. Lingonberries, bilberries, and cloudberries, tart and colorful, were strung on twine or mashed into thick pastes, then stored in wooden boxes or horn containers. Grain was scarce in the far north, but when available, it was milled into coarse flour and stored in sacks or wooden barrels, kept high above damp ground. Milk, from sheep or goats, was quickly turned to curd, then to cheese. Soft cheeses were eaten fresh. Hard cheeses were hung in cloth sacks in the eaves of the home, where smoke and cool air helped them dry slowly, safely. Even beer was part of the preservation system. A weak ale, often brewed at home, lasted longer than water, and could be made with dried grains and wild yeasts, passed down from generation to generation. And during the darkest months when snow pressed against the door and the fjords froze over, families would gather around the hearth, draw down their stores, and be thankful for what had lasted. Preservation here was not just about taste or convenience. It was about making sure the sun could set and rise again, without hunger stealing away sleep. So you imagine yourself beside that central fire. The wind howls outside, but in here there is warmth and food hanging above, packed in barrels, wrapped in cloth, stored not just with skill, but with love. Because the Viking home was not just a shelter from weather, it was a fortress against time. Now let us journey west, across the choppy waters of the North Sea, through soft rains and whispering winds, to the green rolling hills of early Ireland. Here, the land is wet, soft underfoot, blanketed with moss, tall grass, and ancient stone walls. And beneath this land lies a secret, a dark, spongy treasure chest known as the bog. The bogs of Ireland, those vast, quiet wetlands of peat and sphagnum moss, were more than natural features. They were used for fuel, for cutting turf, and, surprisingly, for preserving food. Most famously, butter. Imagine yourself in a round earthen house with a thatched roof. The fire crackles low. Outside, the mist gathers. You hold in your arms a tightly wrapped bundle of cloth. Inside it is freshly churned butter. But this butter isn't meant for today. It's meant for months from now, perhaps for the winter, perhaps as tribute, perhaps even as a sacred offering. And so, you walk to the bog. The ground gives gently beneath your feet. The smell of damp grass and rich earth fills your nose. You find a spot, hidden, cool, and waterlogged, and you dig, not too deep, just enough. You place the bundle carefully, and you cover it again. The bog will do the rest. What happens next is simple chemistry, slow, cold, and oxygen-free. The butter doesn't rot. Instead, it transforms. Over time, the acids in the peat soak in. The butter darkens, hardens. It becomes something different, strong-smelling, but still edible. In some cases, it might stay preserved for years. And while it may sound strange today, this bog butter was a common, accepted part of life for many centuries. Not just a curiosity, but a storage method that required no cellars, no jars, and no buildings. Other foods, too, were buried or hidden in the landscape. Grains were dried, bagged, and stored in small stone silos or in deep pits beneath the home. Meat was salted and smoked, then kept in wooden boxes lined with ash or hung in rafters near the hearth. Cheese was stored in cool caves, wrapped in leaves, protected with beeswax, kept far from flies and rodents. And in regions near the sea, fish, especially herring, was dried in the open air or pickled in brine and stored in barrels sealed with pitch. Even seaweed was harvested and dried, pressed into cakes, and stored for use as food or seasoning through the long winters. Preservation was everywhere, but the bog was special. It was not just cold and wet, it was sacred, and so some of the butter buried there may not have been meant to be recovered. Some archaeologists believe bog butter was an offering, a gift to spirits, to gods, to the mysterious otherworld that lingered just beneath the moss. To leave food in the bog was to entrust it to something beyond. Indeed, many of the bog butters discovered in recent decades, thousands of years old, were never retrieved. They sat in silence, wrapped in bark or animal hide, waiting, a record of caution, of care, of belief. So you imagine yourself placing your own bundle into the peat. The earth is cool, your hands are damp. You say nothing, but you know this is how your family endures, quietly, carefully, with patience, and trust in the land beneath your feet. Because in ancient Ireland, the ground was not just something you walked on, it was something you could rely on. Now we move east again, following the flow of history down the twin rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates, to the cradle of civilization, ancient Mesopotamia. This was a land of invention, of the first cities, the first laws, the first writing, and nestled quietly among these great innovations were the quiet routines of food preservation. Imagine yourself in a low, rectangular house made of mud bricks. The sun filters through a high window. Your kitchen is simple, no chimney, no oven, no metal tools. But on a clay shelf near the wall sit rows of pots, each sealed with a flat disc of clay or a piece of linen tied tight with twine. Inside, food meant for tomorrow, next week, maybe even next month. In Mesopotamia, preservation began with storage. Clay pots, bitumen-sealed, smooth and porous, were the backbone of every kitchen. They held grain, beer, dried fruit, and occasionally even meat preserved in fat. The climate here was hot and dry, so certain foods could be sun-dried with relative ease. Figs and dates were sliced and laid on mats of woven reeds. Once dry, they were pressed into sticky cakes, dense, sweet, and able to last for weeks. These cakes could be eaten alone, or mixed into bread dough or stews. Dates in particular were abundant, and the syrup they produced, date molasses, became not only a sweetener, but a kind of sealant, a way to coat fruit or cook grains to delay spoilage. Grain, ever present in daily life, was dried thoroughly before storage. Sacks of barley and emmer wheat were stacked in cool corners, or kept in large clay bins set into the ground. Water was precious, but beer, thick, cloudy, and low in alcohol, was common. It was brewed fresh, often daily, but some forms were stored longer, and that meant keeping the ingredients dry and safe. Grain malted and dried on rooftops, yeast cultures reused and passed down like family heirlooms. Meat was less common, but when available it was preserved in salt, or sometimes cooked in animal fat and stored in tightly sealed jars. This method, known much later as confit, had early origins here. The fat kept air out, and the meat, if salted first, could last much longer than fresh cuts. In the marshy south, fish was plentiful, but fish spoils fast, so it was gutted, salted, and either smoked over dung fires or dried in the sun. The smell was strong, but the food endured. Every fire in a Mesopotamian kitchen was built from collected dung and reeds, slow-burning, smoky, and steady, perfect for slow cooking, for drying herbs, or for keeping food warm, without burning. Salt was also used as currency, and yet it was employed wisely in food preparation, a fine dusting to preserve cheese, a heavy layer to cure meat. Even onions and garlic were dried and braided, hung from wooden beams to keep them safe from the damp ground. And still, there were risks: mice, humidity, unexpected rain, a cracked jar, a forgotten lid, so every item had to be checked, watched. Tended. Preservation wasn't passive. It was a conversation between food, container, and climate, a dance of intention. So you imagine yourself leaning over a pot. You remove the lid. The scent of old grain and dust rises. You stir it gently with a wooden stick, no mold, no smell, no insects. You nod and replace the lid, because tomorrow this will be bread, and next week it may be beer, and one cracked jar could be a hungry night. In Mesopotamia, food was the measure of time, and to preserve it was to keep time in your own hands. Now we turn eastward once more, to the river valleys of the Yellow and Yangtze, to terraced hillsides, bamboo groves, and tiled roofs, to ancient China, vast, layered, and quietly sophisticated in the ways of keeping food not only fresh, but meaningful. Preservation here was not merely practical, it was cultural, symbolic, and, at times, an art. Imagine yourself in a rural home 2,000 years ago. The morning mist still clings to the trees. You walk into the courtyard. Lined against the far wall are clay jars, wide, sealed, some half buried in the earth. Their sides are cool, their surfaces painted with black ink, naming what's within: pickled cabbage, fermented beans, salted duck eggs, preserved ginger. These are your winter companions. In ancient China, fermentation and salting were deeply intertwined with everyday life. From the poorest farmer to the emperor himself, preserved foods found their place on the table. Cabbage and mustard greens were salted and weighted in ceramic crocks. Over days and weeks, natural fermentation took hold. Lactic acid developed, the vegetables softened, the flavors deepened. This wasn't just storage, it was transformation. The result, swan chai, or sour vegetable, could last through the cold months, added to rice, boiled into soup, or eaten plain. Soybeans were treated with similar care. Cooked, cooled, then inoculated with a living mold, Aspergillus oryzae, and left to ferment. This process yielded soy paste, then soy sauce, both of which could keep for months or longer, both of which added not just flavor, but stability. Meat, too, was preserved. Duck eggs were packed in clay and ash, mixed with salt and rice hulls. Left undisturbed for weeks, they became century eggs, with darkened yolks, creamy whites, and a pungent aroma. They weren't meant to trick time, but to bend it. Pork was sliced thin, marinated with rice wine and sugar, then hung to dry in the cold air of late autumn. These strips, sweet and chewy, could be stored for weeks. A snack, a gift, a reminder of the season just past. And in wealthier households, food storage was not only about endurance, it was about refinement. Elaborate ice cellars were carved beneath palaces and estate houses. During winter, blocks of ice were harvested from frozen rivers and stored underground, insulated by straw and earth. This ice could last well into summer, used to chill fruit, wine, or delicate dishes reserved for the elite. Even fruit itself was preserved with elegance. Plums, apricots, and kumquats were soaked in honey or dried in sun-warmed baskets, stored in silk-wrapped boxes or sealed pots, each piece carefully layered, turned, and checked. And still, across every level of society, the same logic held true. Preserve what you cannot finish. Keep what the season gives. Respect the effort behind the harvest. Because in a land shaped by flood and famine, war and dynasty, preservation was not simply a way to survive. It was a way to bring order to chaos, to make the unpredictable endurable. So you imagine yourself lifting the lid of a stone jar, the smell of aged soy, the glisten of fermented beans, a taste from another time, and perhaps in the quiet of your kitchen you think, this was once fresh, but now it is better. Now we move south, into the lush, humid lands of the Indian subcontinent, where rivers wind through forests, where monsoons fall heavy, and where the air itself feels rich with life. But life, as always, brings with it a challenge: how to make food last in heat, in humidity, in time. In ancient India, preservation was woven into the fabric of daily life. It was not merely functional, it was flavorful, it was fragrant, and it was often delicious. Imagine yourself in a small stone house near the Ganges River. The morning sun has risen, and already the air is warm. In the courtyard, rows of jars are set out in the light. Some contain mango slices, steeped in mustard oil and spices. Others are filled with limes, chilies, ginger, or tamarind, soaking slowly in salt and turmeric. These are pickles, achar, and each one is its own recipe, passed down from mother to daughter, neighbor to neighbor, adjusted with taste, climate, and memory. Salt draws out the moisture, spices prevent spoilage, and oil creates a protective seal from air. Together, they preserve not just food, but identity. Pickling in India was never just one method. It was a spectrum. Lemons could be sun-dried and packed with black salt. Carrots fermented in earthen pots. Garlic preserved with jaggery, creating a sweet, spicy tang. And while vegetables dominated the pickle jars, fruits and herbs were no exception. In the dry West, slices of raw mango were dried on rooftops, powdered with chili, and stored in cloth pouches. In the tropical South, tamarind was boiled and stored as thick paste, tart, complex, and shelf-stable. A spoonful added to lentils or rice transformed the meal. But not all preservation relied on salt. Some used sweetness. Honey, with its thick golden stillness, was a powerful preservative. Fruits were poached in honey and stored in glazed clay pots. Pomegranate seeds, Indian gooseberries, amla, tart and dense with vitamin C. Even flower petals, like rose, were candied and layered in sugary syrup. These preserves weren't just practical. They were medicinal. They were ceremonial. Amla, steeped in honey, was considered a tonic. Rose petals and sugar became gulkand, a cooling paste eaten in summer, said to aid digestion and bring balance to the body. Vinegar, too, found its place. Derived from fermented sugarcane juice or toddy palm sap, it was used sparingly, often in coastal regions where Portuguese and Arab influence later brought new flavors. In temple kitchens, where meat was absent and meals were sacred, food was carefully dried and stored, lentils roasted and kept in jars, rice sealed against insects, spices preserved whole to retain their oils and strength. And in wealthier homes, food preservation was a form of hospitality. The arrival of a guest might prompt the opening of a special jar, something aged, rare, fragrant, perhaps a spiced lime pickle, sharp and darkened by time, perhaps a candy made with dried ginger and saffron. Every bite a memory, every flavor a story. So, you imagine yourself sitting beneath a shady tree, a clay bowl in your lap. Inside, a spoonful of sweet mango pickle, warm from the sun, glistening with oil and spice. You taste it. It burns slightly on your tongue, then melts into something soft, sour, bright, and you think, this is summer, captured, and still here. Because in ancient India, food was preserved not only to survive, but to remember. Until now, we've wandered through cellars and huts, across windswept plains and river valleys, and through the quiet daily rhythms of ordinary people trying to make their food last. But what of the wealthy? What of the kings, queens, emperors, priests, and merchants? Those who feasted while others fasted, who dined on dishes the rest of the world preserved only in dreams? Even in ancient times, luxury did not mean freedom from spoilage. Meat still rotted, fish still soured, fruit still bruised. But the rich had one advantage: people, servants, cooks, guards, stewards, and they had another: infrastructure. Let us enter, then, not a peasant's kitchen, but a palace. Imagine the tiled corridors of a Roman villa. The marble is cool beneath your feet. Outside, the heat simmers. But within, stone walls and shaded courtyards help keep the air still. Down a narrow passage, you find the kulina, the kitchen. Large jars line the floor. Olive oil, wine, vinegar. Spices in small ceramic pots. Salted fish and brine. But the real luxury? Snow, packed in straw and delivered from the distant Alps. Snow and ice were stored in deep stone pits, refrigeria, kept dark and sealed. They weren't freezers in the modern sense, but they allowed for cold drinks, chilled desserts, even temporary storage of delicate items. Elsewhere in the world, similar practices developed. In Persia, ice was hauled from the mountains and stored in yakchals, conical ice houses designed with mathematical precision to keep the contents cold for months. In China's imperial courts, entire underground ice vaults were filled with frozen river blocks during winter. These allowed the emperor and his family to enjoy chilled melons in the middle of summer, not a necessity, but a declaration. Food was also preserved by turnover. In elite households, food didn't need to last, because it never sat for long. Dozens of servants processed fresh deliveries each morning, bread was baked anew, meat was slaughtered only hours before being served, vegetables were picked at dawn, but even the rich preserved. In medieval castles, vast pantries and butteries held smoked meats, dried fruits, and preserved cheeses. Giant wheels of cheese coated in wax, pears packed in honey, fish smoked over slow fires, and hung in stone kitchens beneath thick beams. In Ottoman palaces, sherbets were preserved with sugar and lemon, kept in crystal bottles. Pickled vegetables, cured meats, rosewater syrups, each had its own storage vessel, often sealed with beeswax or cloth soaked in oil. In Mughal India, meat was marinated with vinegar, yogurt, and spice, then cooked and sealed in jars with a layer of oil, not only to keep, but to enhance. Luxury preservation wasn't only about protection, it was about elevation. To the wealthy, preserving food meant controlling time, keeping strawberries past spring, savoring lamb long after the slaughter, tasting mango in the middle of the rains. But even here, there was fear. Spoilage was always possible. One cracked lid, one too warm day, one shipment delayed, and so, panic lived quietly behind the opulence. Tasters were employed to sample food before it reached noble lips, checking not just for poison, but for spoilage. Recipes included preservation instructions as carefully guarded as the ingredients themselves. How many days to ferment? How many pinches of salt? Which herbs deterred mold? Which containers best resisted mice? So, you imagine yourself in the scullery of a great house. The kitchen is hushed. The stew has cooled. A covered platter is carefully wrapped in cloth. Then, placed in the cellar beneath the stone. It will be eaten tonight, or tomorrow, or perhaps forgotten. Because even in the courts of kings, food waited, and those who served it waited too. Because to be rich meant always eating first, but also always fearing waste. And now at last, we return to something familiar, to the world you know, at least almost. Not quite the humming refrigerator in your kitchen, not quite the frost-lined freezer behind the supermarket door, but the beginning of cold coming home. The modern age of preservation did not arrive all at once. It crept in slowly, block by block, wagon by wagon, ice by the ton. Imagine yourself in a small American town in the 1800s. The winter has passed. The lakes have frozen, thick and solid, and the ice harvest begins. Men cut enormous blocks of ice from the surface of the water. Each block is wrapped in sawdust and packed tightly in wooden crates, then shipped by train, by cart, by boat, to cities and towns where summer heat will soon return. This ice doesn't just chill lemonade, it changes lives. For the first time, families have ice boxes, wooden cabinets lined with metal, fitted with a chamber for a large block of ice. Milk lasts a little longer. Meat doesn't spoil overnight. Leftovers become thinkable. Deliveries are made daily or weekly. Children wait for the Iceman, hoping for chips to suck on. Mothers measure how long each block will last. A warm day shortens it by hours, but the idea has taken root. Cold can be captured, controlled, used. In Europe, similar revolutions unfold. Urban families buy food less frequently. Chefs experiment with chilled desserts. Butchers offer previously unthinkable cuts. Delis bloom, and with them, cold becomes commerce. Factories begin to produce artificial ice, first using ammonia systems, then safer gases later on. Refrigerated rail cars allow meat to be shipped across countries. Ships carry frozen goods across oceans, and the idea of seasonal eating begins to fade. In the early 20th century, electric refrigerators appear in homes. Slowly at first, expensive, noisy, unfamiliar, but they improve. They become quieter, smaller, more affordable, and soon, they are expected. By the 1950s, a home without a refrigerator seems backward. Freezers follow, microwaves, plastic, wrap, vacuum sealing, and with these tools, food is not just preserved, it is distanced, made less fragile, less urgent. You can eat strawberries in December, fish from another continent, soup from a box. And yet, somewhere deep in the rhythm of daily life, the echoes of older methods remain. A jar of pickles on a pantry shelf, a smoked sausage in a deli, a sourdough starter on a kitchen counter. Even now we ferment, we brine, we dry, we remember. Because preservation was never just about food, it was about time, about trust, about waiting. So you imagine yourself standing in your kitchen. The refrigerator hums softly in the background. Its light flickers on as you open the door. You reach inside. Everything is cold. Everything is ready. And yet, as you close the door, perhaps you think of cellars, of pits, of jars and salt and sunlight, of all the quiet hands that yours. And so we have wandered across deserts and forests, mountains and plains, through the silence of ancient caves, the smoke of simple kitchens, and the cool, slow patience of buried jars. We have seen how people everywhere, across centuries and continents, met the same simple problem: how to keep food from slipping away. There were no refrigerators, no packaging, no plastic lids. There was only earth and wind. And knowledge passed quietly from one generation to the next. Clay pots sealed with wax, fish dried in cold air, butter buried in the ground, fruits pressed in honey, milk turned to cheese, turned to curd, turned to powder. Each method, a reflection of its place, of its people, of its needs, and always beneath it all, a sense of care. Because to preserve food was to protect life, to carry forward a little comfort into the hunger of winter, to give your child something warm to eat, when the season gave nothing in return. Even now, in a world of flashing lights and digital displays, we return to these old ways. We ferment, pickle, dry, and store. We keep what we can. We share what lasts. We pass down jars with labels written in fading ink. And perhaps, as you fall asleep, you might imagine someone long ago, checking a sealed pot, slicing dried meat, turning a fruit in the sun, saving something quietly, carefully, for someone they loved. That story never really ended. It simply changed shape. So rest easy now. The fire is low. The jars are sealed. The work is done. And tomorrow, there will be something to eat. Good night.